Calvin Case was lost again, this time in his own hometown. While walking down the sidewalk in the business district, he had been, as was his custom, looking up at the tall buildings. That's why he didn't notice the street lamp pole that he walked into head first. Badly shaken, Calvin couldn't remember who he was or where he lived. He stopped the first person that passed on the street and asked, "Who am I? Where do I live?" The man was a psychiatrist. He said, "You are who you choose to be, and you live within the confines of your mind." Calvin didn't need that type of advice just then. What he needed was an aspirin, but he thanked the man anyway and asked the next passerby, "Who am I? Where do I live?" The second person was an athlete. He said, "You are who you choose to be, and you live within your body." That still wasn't quite the advice Calvin sought. He crossed the street hoping to find a more specific response to his question. There he asked the next person, "Who am I, and where do I live?" She was a housewife. She said, "You are who you choose to be, and you live at home." "But where is home?" Calvin asked. "Where you make it," she smiled and left. Calvin elected to try his luck one more time. He stopped an affluent-looking man and asked, "Who am I, and where do I live?" The man, too busy to break stride, shouted over his shoulder, "You are who you choose to be, and you live where you work." Calvin finally decided he would have to determine for himself who he was and where he lived. "Perhaps if I retrace my steps prior to the accident, I will recall," he thought. He recrossed the street and began walking. "Let's see," he thought. "I was looking at the tall buildings and—" At that moment, Calvin walked into the lamppost again. His memory returned instantly. "Of course! I'm Calvin Case, and I live at 2525 Oak Street, not far from here," he said. During the short walk home, Calvin reflected upon the advice he had received during his brief bout with amnesia. "Isn't it strange," Calvin thought. "I feel now as though I knew all along who I was and where I lived. That knowledge was buried inside me, just waiting to return. Those others, in their own way, tried to answer those questions for me, yet if what they were trying to say is what I knew all along, then why didn't someone say it?" Calvin knew that the advice he had received was correct. It just wasn't specific enough to fit his needs. The passers-by and Calvin all agreed on one thing, that he was who he decided to be. Yet they all supposed that Calvin lived someplace else. Each selected the mini-environment to which he most closely related. The psychiatrist claimed we live within our minds. The athlete claimed we live within our bodies. The housewife claimed we live at home. The businessman claimed we live at work. To the extent that each person properly identified one of the 4 mini-environments which comprise our total success environment, that individual was correct. To the extent that each individual excluded the other 3 mini-environments, that individual was incorrect. Among the languages of success, there is general agreement that the results are up to us. In other words, we are who we decide to be. But too frequently, the languages discount the role each of our 4 mini-environments has in positively or negatively reinforcing our success in the other mini-environments. We wind up with tunnel vision, concentrating on how to think, or how to dress, or how to get along with our spouse, or how to make money, to the exclusion of living successfully in all 4 mini-environments. Yet, in the long run, we can't succeed in any one mini-environment unless we are reasonably successful in all. I am not a psychiatrist, so I won't hit you with the notion that mind science is the ultimate answer to success. I'm not an athlete, so I won't claim jumping rope 50 times a day will get you there. I'm not a housewife, so I won't tell you that you should go home, bake a pie, and forget everything else. And I'm not some business phenom who made $1 million by age 18 selling sun lamps to natives on Tahiti. So I won't hit you with the notion that the more money you make, the more successful you are. I am a lawyer, and what I will hit you with is logic. And logic tells us this. First, if you think you can think straight without being reasonably fit, having a good home life, and a career that you enjoy, you're nuts. Second, if you think you can look good and feel good physically without having a decent attitude, a decent home, and a decent career, you're nuts. Third, if you think you can enjoy your home while maintaining a lousy attitude, poor health, and working at a job you don't enjoy, you're nuts. And fourth, if you think you can enjoy your job with a poor attitude while looking like a slob and while suffering an unenjoyable home life, you're nuts. The bottom line, logically, is that each of us lives in 4 mini-environments. We live inside our heads where we think, where we formulate our attitudes, perceptions, feelings, and emotions. That's our inside mini-environment. We live inside our bodies, and the way those bodies look and feel is a function of how well we take care of ourselves physically and how well we dress. That's our outside mini-environment. We live at home where we seek comfort, companionship, and security. That's our home mini-environment. And we live at work where we pursue the almighty dollar and the gratification of doing something constructive for someone else. That's our work mini-environment. So what does it all add up to? The manner in which these mini-environments relate to one another, the manner in which they positively or negatively reinforce one another, creates our total success environment. So where do we live and who are we? We live inside, outside, at home and at work. And, as Calvin discovered, we are who we decide to be. Please listen carefully to this dictionary definition of the word environment. Environment. Definition 1. Something that surrounds, surroundings. Definition 2. The total of circumstances surrounding an organism or group of organisms, specifically A, the combination of external or extrinsic physical conditions that affect and influence the growth and development of organisms, and B, the complex of social and cultural conditions affecting the nature of an individual or community. Aren't dictionary definitions exciting? The above definition is compliments of the American Heritage Dictionary of the English language. I once knew a fellow who decided to closely research this definition of environment. He swore to look up the definition of each ambiguous word used therein and to look up the definition of each ambiguous word used in subsequent definitions. He left for the library on February 8, 1957. We haven't seen him since. At the risk of causing you to suffer a similar fate, let me ask you to please listen again to the definition. Study in particular the sentences 2A and 2B. To the extent that we are organisms like amoeba, artichokes, or apes, our environment is comprised of external or extrinsic physical conditions that influence our growth and development. To the extent that we are individuals, human beings, and, presumably, the highest form of life, social and cultural conditions also create our environment. The two environments that affect us most as organisms are our inside and outside environments. In other words, the way we think and the way we take care of and adorn our bodies. As individuals or members of a community, our environments are home and work, the way we relate to others domestically and economically. Now, here's the rub. Let's say we want to define our total or mega environment. We can't do so by merely adding up the other 4 mini-environments. Here's why. Each mini-environment is to the other 3 an external element. For example, the way we feel physically frequently affects the way we feel mentally. If we are physically down, it's difficult to be mentally up. So, physical fitness becomes a factor affecting our inside environment. Similarly, what goes on at home in our mini-home environment can certainly affect what happens in our mini-work environment. For example, you are a pharmacist in Des Moines and it's Monday morning. You're in bed and you open one eye to look at the alarm clock. Panic. You jump from bed. You are 30 minutes late because your wife forgot to set the alarm last night. You know your customers will be lining up outside the pharmacy waiting for you when you arrive. You shout at your wife as you run to the bathroom, expressing in no uncertain terms your displeasure with her forgetfulness. She returns your comments in kind, and as you are struggling to throw on your clothes, you find yourself in a shouting match with her. Your 17-year-old overhears the argument and races into the room and attempts to mediate. He says she wouldn't have forgotten to set the alarm if it hadn't been for the car accident and her concern regarding how to break the news to you. This is the first you've heard about the car, but you haven't time now to obtain details. You race downstairs to find something to eat. The bread is stale, the orange juice is sour. You are out of milk, no cereal. Forget it, you think. I've got to get to the pharmacy. You throw open the door and race outside, forgetting your boots and coat, which was not a smart thing to do because 3 feet of snow had fallen the night before. Instantly you are face down in a snowdrift. Your wife and 17-year-old laugh. That does not help matters. You crawl back inside to find your boots, but you can't, although you do find a coat. You finally make it to the garage and put your keys in the ignition of the car, the one that hadn't been in the accident, only to discover that it won't start. You try again and again to no avail. You have no choice but to walk to the pharmacy a mile away with no boots. You finally make it there, only to find a dozen disgruntled customers standing in front of the door. You reach for your keys. Your hands are nearly frozen. You forgot your gloves, too. Oh, no! The keys are in the car. You trudge the mile through the snow back home, retrieve the keys from your car, and trudge back. Finally, you get the door to the pharmacy open. Your patrons, increasingly angry, swarm to the pharmacy counter. Back and forth you run, filling prescriptions, taking orders, and answering the phone. Your customers are yelling at you now from across the counter. There is one interruption after another. 2 small boys are stealing comic books from the magazine stand. You race after them only to knock over the shampoo display. The phone rings. Your customers keep yelling. You answer the phone and can barely hear the voice on the other end over the din of complaints coming at you from within the store. It's the sweet but slightly senile little old lady who bought a thermometer from you yesterday. In her sweet and unassuming voice she says, "You know that rectal thermometer I bought from you yesterday?" "Yes," you shout into the phone. "What is it?" "How do you use it?" she asks. Now what would you say? So let's not focus upon any one mini-environment to the exclusion of the others. Let us instead first devote our attention to discovering how each mini-environment positively or negatively reinforces the others. Next, we'll devote ourselves to exploring how we may improve our lives in each of our 4 mini-environments, so that we may improve our total success environment overall. He's got his head on straight. He's a good head. His head's in the right place. Sure, we've all heard these expressions before, and we all know generally what they mean. Depending on the context in which they are used, they may refer to an individual with a good attitude, someone who is especially trustworthy, or a man or woman especially adept at communicating well. Of course, being a good head these days may also mean that one has become particularly adroit at rolling his own. It's been said to the point of cliché that one of the few things left on this earth that the human mind has not been able to totally figure out is the human mind. It is a complicated thing, capable, as some now contend, of recording every minute aspect of every experience or thought we ever had or held. And somehow these past recollections no doubt relate to our current perceptions and future judgments. Too often, it is suggested that we can improve our inside mini-environment by simply improving the way we think. There is much to be said in favor of the concept of programming our subconscious mind, as we will discuss later. But it is just too simplistic an approach to believe that we, like a computer, can be programmed without taking into account the trillions of often conflicting impulses that are shooting around inside our cerebellums. Most of us, for example, talk about maintaining a good attitude without having any idea of what attitude means. We tend to confuse it with concepts such as emotions, feelings, dispositions, temperaments, and even logic. At the risk of remaining simplistic, let us concede that there are at least 3 categories of thought processes that pass through our minds every second. The first set of impulses we'll call the Einstein mode. This mode can best be characterized by the words reason, logic, and intellect. It is the rational decision-making we do on a daily basis. It includes the collection and sifting of data, the weighing of alternative choices, and the selection of action. The second mode might be called the Judy Garland mode. It is best characterized by the words emotion and feeling. Subjective processes virtually impossible to define, such as joy, sorrow, reverence, hate, or love, are within this category. It includes all the things we feel, as opposed to what our logic or reason, Einstein mode, might tell us. The final category is the Dale Carnegie mode. It is best described by the words attitude and disposition. It is our customary manner of emotional response, our temperament, our manner of thinking, behaving, and reacting in a characteristic fashion. It is the manner in which our Einstein mode has programmed us to react to our Judy Garland mode. Just as with, on a larger scale, our 4 mini-environments, these 3 modes within the inside environment can and do positively or negatively reinforce each other. Each mode is an external factor that can affect the other 2 modes. We can, for example, through the Einstein mode, our logic, condition our Carnegie mode, our attitudes and dispositions, to function and react in a certain way. Similarly, our Carnegie mode, our attitudes, can affect our Judy Garland mode, our emotions and feelings, by providing a characteristic manner in which we deal with, sustain, or reject our more subjective mental processes. Oh, wonderful, you say. We're not even through the second tape, and already we have 4 mini-environments, 1 mega-environment, and 3 modes within the first mini-environment. And this is supposed to be simple. How many more modes, megas, and minis will I have to contend with? Just a few. And you'll probably survive the process. And I promise that once you make it through tape 3, it should all fall into place. The important point about these 3 mental modes is that because they reinforce each other, we must recognize that when we talk about improving our attitudes and dispositions as the primary method of improving our inside environment, that we are at the same time affecting our logical and emotive states. Moreover, when we focus in later tapes upon using our logic to program our mind, we will be affecting the emotive and attitudinal states as well. Yet, when we concentrate on one mode, we only indirectly affect the others. All this means that it is probably a waste of time to try to directly control all of our mental processes all the time. Too frequently, people regard positive self-image psychology as a syrupy panacea, a cosmetic powder with which we should cover and hide the ugly face of our inward discontent, a method of whitewashing and ignoring our true feelings, or logic. Instead, this program is devoted to providing the listener with attitudinal tools with which to positively manage some of our deeper thought modes, which, after all, make us human beings. Our approach is much like the moral of the story about the old Indian who watched the white men build a lighthouse. Day after day, the old Indian sat in silence and watched as white men erected the tower. He observed as they ignited the lamp and watched its first night of operation. He returned to his tribe and they asked him, "How successful was the white man's lighthouse?" "Big failure," he replied. "White man make big tower, light big bulb, cast light into ocean, but fog come in just the same." Mentally, our fog will continue to roll in, especially in the form of more negative or sad emotions and feelings. Our job with the inside mini environment is to create as helpful and positive a context as possible with which to deal, conquer, and control these innermost feelings. Isn't it enough that we are rarely able to exert direct influence over the emotions we feel, our Judy Garland mode? Yet why do so many people insist upon treating their attitudes, our Carnegie mode, in similar fashion? We've all heard people say, "I feel good today," or "I feel lazy today," or "I feel discouraged today," as though they were talking about visitors from outer space, men from Mars who just dropped in for the day to affect their behavior. It is, perhaps, more convenient to regard our attitudes or dispositions, our Carnegie mode, as occasional and unpredictable visitors from outer space. That, at least, relieves us of the burden of accepting the responsibility for our temperament. Yet even an iota of personal worth, and even the slightest acceptance of responsibility for our individual status, forces us to conclude that our attitudes can and should be totally within our ability to control. Much as a parent might regard his responsibility toward and control over his children. It's entirely possible that we can only indirectly affect our emotions, the Garland mode. It is certainly true that we are not all born with the same logical or reasoning prowess, the Einstein mode. But we don't have to be Einsteins or unemotive rocks to be able to control our temperament, the manner in which we perceive ourselves and the world around us. Some may argue that by affecting our Carnegie mode, our attitudes, we may directly affect our Einstein mode, logic, or our Garland mode, emotions. They may be right. But let's be as conservative as possible and assume that the attitudes we can control will have at least an indirect and potentially positive effect upon the mental modes over which we have less control. An indirect effect is better than no effect at all. 1 out of 3 ain't bad. Most would agree, for example, that Pete Rose, Mr. Baseball, Charlie Hustle, is a very successful man at what he does. Indeed, for all but one season of his major league career, he has batted over .300. But that means that even Pete Rose gets a hit only 1 out of every 3 times at bat. If half a loaf is better than none, then a third of a loaf is better than none as well. We can argue all day over the extent to which adjustment of our attitudes directly or indirectly affects the rest of our mental processes. But that debate is irrelevant if we can conclude, and logic leads us to this conclusion, that it can have some effect, often a profound effect, upon what goes on in our inside mini environment. Our focus, then, will be upon the Carnegie or attitudinal mode, with the assumption that by positively building our attitudes, we can, to a greater or lesser extent, positively build the rest of our inside mini environment as well. Success is an inside job. The extent to which you take control of and accept responsibility for your attitudes is entirely up to you. We must view our attitudes as tools capable of being welded and shaped to the desired form to fit the desired purpose. They are ours to use as the method by which we build our total inside mini environment. But the tools must be honed and put to use. We must allow our Einstein mode, our logic, to accept that basic notion. Once accepted, it can positively reinforce our efforts to learn techniques and methods by which we use attitudes as the tools for shaping our inside mini environment. But it is an inside job. And it begins with your head and your logic. It is a personal responsibility. The results are up to you. Without that basic commitment, all the rest is pure verbiage, a wasted exercise in semantics. It is entirely possible that real progress cannot be made in any of the three remaining mini environments without there first being progress in our inside mini environment. Whether that is true is probably irrelevant, much like the chicken and the egg argument. But suffice it here to say that it must start with you inside, in your head. You may choose not to differentiate between emotions or logic or attitudes. You may choose to accept the notion that the mind simply cannot explain itself and therefore you won't try. You may choose to regard your attitudes as visitors from outer space over which you have no control. Or you may choose, in a fashion consistent with your potential as a human being and with your purpose for occupying space on this planet, first, that your attitudes are controllable by you and only by you. Second, that there are methods by which you may adopt positive attitudes to be used as tools for positively affecting your inside mini environment, and that, third, you and you alone are totally responsible for learning and mastering all the methods available to create positive attitudinal tools for use within your own inside mini environment. Success is an inside job. It starts with you.